Okay, we are live.
All right, we are reconvening our morning hearing and going to be hearing from Shane Jake with the Nature Conservancy.
Would you like me to wait for?
No, we're ready.
Okay.
Please.
Everybody sat down so I didn't trip anybody with the cord here. Okay, thank you for inviting me to speak with you on this topic. Okay. My name is Shane Jakewith. I am the Watershed Restoration Program Manager for the Nature Conservancy chapter here in Vermont.
You have a bar up on your first slide there behind.
Thank you. I've been with the Nature Conservancy since 2016 in this position. Prior to that, I worked for the Department of Environmental Conservation's Rivers Program, start going back to 1998. Our work at the Nature Conservancy and water revolves around three primary pillars. The first is river corridor protection. Second is dam removal. And the third is river and floodplain restoration. Through that work, we really endeavor to improve water quality, work to increase biodiversity. Increase biodiversity of Vermont's aquatic ecosystems, and improve the flood resilience of Vermont's human communities. So that's my work. So I don't know really how to handle this. This is a little bit of a situation being third on the list here. Following those two presentations, I feel like you've heard a lot of what I'm going to start off with.
I would interrupt and just say it's okay for us to hear repeats, and you're all coming at it from a different angle.
Right.
So we're happy. Don't apologize. We know you're third, and
Okay.
I think it'll be different.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that advice. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the benefits that beavers provide us. And we did hear some of this, but yes, in perspective, coming from a different place. So beavers certainly provide a lot of biodiversity. Beaver ponds and beaver pond complexes and beaver meadows are biological, ecological hotspots. Everything from amphibians, reptiles, aquatic insects, terrestrial insects, wading birds, waterfowl, songbirds, mammals, small mammals, large mammals, plants, and trees, right? All really thrive in these systems. They are biodiversity hotspots. And it's not just in the ponds, as I mentioned. I just mentioned the beaver meadows. So after the ponds drain, after the ponds are abandoned, and the ponds drain over time, they leave behind this really fertile soil. And that grows really intensely a wide variety of herbaceous species that are really pollinator hotspots. You know, we think about bees and butterflies. These beaver meadows provide incredible habitat for those species. I've heard beavers referred to as rotational grazers, and some of you have experience with this perhaps, where they will develop a pond, live there until that food resource runs dry. They move up or down valley, build another pond, and as I mentioned, that pond drains and becomes a wet meadow. So you get this diversity in these systems. You have a pond, spatial diversity of different habitat types. You have the beaver pond habitat, you have the beaver meadow habitat over here, and another beaver type of habitat in a different stage of its life cycle up here. And these are all areas that and often would just be forested. Not that forests are bad, forests are great, but it really is a homogeneous sort of habitat, right? It's just continuous closed canopy forest. So they open up the canopy and they create these different ecosystems. spatially across the landscape. So diving in, so that's beaver and biodiversity. So now let's turn to beaver and water quality. And again, some repeat here, but perhaps that this visual helps a little bit. So thinking about water quality and so to some extent flood resilience. So looking at the top of the pond, the stream that comes in, right? The stream comes into the pond and the energy of that stream is dissipated. The pollutants in that water coming in are absorbed. When the waters in the bottom of the pond sink into the underlying aquifers or hyporheic zone, as it's called, they are cooled, right? They pass through the root systems of those aquatic plants, and they are filtered, removing again those. And then that water that's in those aquifers is stored and can be for quite some time and slowly released to downslope streams. And that water comes in, it comes in cold, and it usually comes in when flows are otherwise very low. So when we have these periods of these dry periods and dry and warm periods, these streams are being recharged from that groundwater that is sunk into the aquifer from the beaver pond. So it's really critical, especially trout habitat. I think 74 degrees is the temperature at which trout start to go belly up. So, and we often have a hard time. That's often a limiting factor for trout habitat in Vermont is water temperature. So the importance of these, they're ultimately groundwater recharge systems. So they're really important from that perspective. Okay, so beaver and climate change, looking at drought and wildfire. Again, we've heard a little bit on this. This is from the State of Vermont Climate Action Office, and really the key words here: Vermont climate change, drought, flooding, wildfires. We're already experiencing these impacts of climate change in Vermont. So, sometimes I say drought in this state, and people roll their eyes. And I'm not saying it's a huge problem right now, but it's something that we are seeing a slight uptick in. If we look at NOAA's drought center, we see that currently 18 or 18.9 or 19% of the state is in moderate drought, and 72% is in abnormally dry condition. Sorry, I am trying to get rid of this window that's covering up my view of some of these slides.
You don't see it right now.
I just did it. Okay. Further, in 2000, 2016, 2020, and 22, New York and New England experienced historic drought conditions not seen since the 1960s. So evidence pointing to the fact that climate change is causing an uptick in drought. So as we saw from Ben, out west where they live with drought, they've been living with drought in the arid west a lot longer than we have. They've really recognized the benefits of beaver ponds to get them through these drought periods. And they've recognized the importance of beaver influenced valleys and these beaver pond complexes in serving as fire breaks, really the only areas that aren't completely annihilated from wildfire. So that's out west. Turning back to Vermont and looking at the issue that we're all much more familiar with, and that is flooding. Again, climate change playing a role here, driving a lot of the increase in flooding and flood damage that we're seeing. This slide from Climate Central points out that between 1958 and 2011, the amount of precipitation events that we are receiving as intense precipitation events has increased by 74%. Right, I think we're all aware of that, but definitely an important piece of this story. A couple studies, one from Dartmouth College and one from the Gund Institute, pointing out that the cost associated with this increase in flood damage associated with climate change is going to be significant. So beaver play a role in helping with the mitigation of these flood hazards. But before I get right into that point, I think it's really important to set the context here in Vermont. And that really all starts with our history of settlement, European settlement, and the river management that came with that. In Ben's book, he lays out some great historical accounts, and really fascinating and compelling accounts from early European fur traders, early settlers, the Lewis and Clark expedition, and others. And in one of those, there's an account from a guy in the Adirondacks who talks about every river from the largest to the most insignificant, river, stream, and rill being occupied by beavers to the extent that it appeared that those animals had completely dominated the landscape, right? So these beavers were everywhere, and they've significantly influenced our riverscapes. This is the Clyde up in the Kingdom on the top left. And I think it's a great example of what a lot of our rivers used to look like. Fully forested, room for beavers to do their thing. It's very meandering. It overtops its banks readily. When flows do overtop their banks, that flow is confounded by thickets of herbaceous growth and trees, both standing and dead. It really is a system that is much different than most of the streams we see throughout the state. Looking at it on the ground in lower right, it's probably a system of beaver dams and ponds, kind of like beads on a string, where those ponds are really playing that role, those roles I mentioned earlier in absorbing waters, filtering pollutants, et cetera. So that's what things looked like, pre-settlement. Then settlement hit. And settlement was hard. It's hard on the forest, and it was hard on our rivers and our wetlands. First, the fur trappers came through, just about extirpated beaver from the entire continent. I've heard said that beavers were almost entirely gone from the Connecticut River Valley before Vermont was a state. And when you consider that beaver dams have been estimated to exist at a density of one dam every 25 to 100 yards on just about every stream on the continent, the instantaneous, well, I shouldn't say instantaneous, the fairly rapid removal, the fur trade, the fur trapping period wasn't all that long in its greatest intensity. That left, I think Ben put it well, it was sort of an ecological and geological event, right? It completely transformed our water courses, completely transformed them. And then following the fur trapping came the log drives, right? Robert Pike, in his book Tall Trees and Tough Men, recounts, teams of men, right, working from early April to late November, from dawn to dusk, waist deep in the muck and mire, hitching snags, complete with completely overtopped with mud from centuries of sediment accumulation, and snagging those out of the rivers to make way for the log drives. So hundreds of years of dead wood in our streams removed in that period. So again, our rivers just completely transformed. The log drives happened. Splash dams are built on the right side here. Those were dams that created impoundments that were loaded with loaded with logs. And when the time was right, the gates to those dams were sprung open, and that wood and water just went downstream in a torrent that had really significant impact on the stream systems. As you might imagine, the log drives on the white and the bottom. And of course, we cleared almost 80% of our landscape, and that had tremendous impacts on how rapidly, and what that water was carrying as it made its way downstream or down valley to the river bottoms. So tremendous impact on our systems. And then after that, to make way for the agriculture and surrounding building development and roadways, there was a lot of straightening, dredging, and armoring of our river systems. This was all done to keep the water in the river and keep the rivers out of the way. And it's very intuitive. It makes a heck of a lot of sense when you're standing there on the landscape, right? It's not just Vermont. It's just not just the US. This is a global phenomenon. This is what we as humans do. I think I would be one of the first ones to have done that if I lived in that time, right? But we realize that there are consequences to that. So, there's an image of a dynamite page from the Farmer's Handbook on, dynamite about blasting streams to get them out of the way. We have some images from Irene of machines, hogging out the channels to make them deeper. Some of these streams looking down from the air on some of the streams that have been straightened, Lower Granville in the White River Valley, the Black River up in Fairfield on the bottom, and then over to the right, my home watershed, the Huntington River. You can see all these streams run pretty straight, have sharp bends, and some of them are peculiarly placed right up against the toe of the valley wall. Not really in the middle of the valley at all, where we might expect them to be. So just evidence that this has all happened. This is nothing new. We understand this. So all of that had great implications on flood hazards and lays the groundwork for where we are today. So just really quickly, because I think this is important, because when you understand where we are and where we got here, how we got here, I think it really helps us understand the role that beaver have to play in helping us mitigate these flood hazards. So talking about flood hazards, first, I think it's important to distinguish inundation hazard from erosion hazard and damage. Inundation is simply that when the water comes up, we get wet, our basements fill with sediment. It's a really difficult situation to deal with. And then there's erosion, right? That's when rivers move. They adjust wildly or with large scale, and they undermine our infrastructure, our houses, and other investments. The former, the inundation, is really catastrophic. Individuals, families, businesses really harmed and by this, and it's really hard to recover from those instances. But they do not compare in comparison in terms of cost to the erosion damage. Erosion damage is our primary and most costly form of flood damage. So when we think of flood damage, it's really important that we think about the erosion damage. And we're going to talk more about that. So why does the straightening and the dredging lead to that erosion damage? It's really pretty straightforward. Once you step back and think about it. Rivers in their natural condition, as shown on the top, channels are small, floodplains are broad. When the rains fall and the snow melts, the water in those channels quickly spreads out onto that broad floodplain and the energy is dissipated. It's the pressure relief valve of the system, right? If you have a hydronic heating system in your house, that plumbed into that system are pressure relief valves. The floodplain is a pressure relief valve of that system. Of course, that means any adjacent structures, investments get wet, and that's problematic. And, as we all know, we have often in the past resorted to dredging those channels deeper to keep all the water in the channel. The problem with that is the erosive force, the power of flowing water comes from its depth. And that's because every cubic foot of water weighs 62.4 pounds. So every foot on top of foot on top of foot that you add, you're adding another 62.4 pounds on the bed of that channel. And that water is scraping the bottom of that channel, right? And all that weight means that it's going to scrape and drag and mobilize the boulders and the cobbles and the gravels and sands on the bottom of that bed. So the bed down cuts even further than it was dug. And eventually those banks get so high and that erosive energy gets so strong that the toes of those banks just let go. And as shown in the bottom there, the banks just collapse and our investments fall in. And that's the erosion hazard. That's where we are today, right? That's where we are today. Our channels are incised is the term for that. They've incised into the landscape. The other thing with dredging is that it often is accompanied by straightening of the channel. And when you straighten a channel, you make it steeper, right? The shortest path between point A and point B is a straight line. So you make the channel shorter. And if you're talking about a drop in elevation from point A to point B, the shorter path is going to be the steeper path as shown in the graph there. It's just rise over run, right? We all probably remember that equation for calculating slope. So we make the channel steeper. So along with depth, slope is the other primary factor in calculating the power of a stream. We talk about stream power. It's depth and slope, right? So we've made our channels steeper, deeper, more powerful, more erosive, and that has gotten us into this situation of increased flood vulnerability. So this is a simple channel evolution model. It's similar to the one I had up a couple minutes ago, that diagram. It just goes through a little further. The house is there getting wet, berms are built, the waters are trapped in the channel, the excess energy works on the bed, it deepens, it goes into a widening phase, and it works through until it gets down to the bottom stage where it's kind of stable again. It's another stable condition. Okay, that's a channel evolution model. The State of Vermont Rivers Program and the Department of Environmental Conservation has surveyed 5,000 miles of river to understand the physical condition of those channels and found that 75% of those surveyed miles are in the stages 1, 2, or 3 of this evolution process, meaning they're disconnected from their floodplain, they're enlarged, and they're highly unstable. Again, that's the current context. You know, all of this started so long ago that we lost track of what our rivers looked like and how they functioned. And we find ourselves relying solely on the dredging, berming, and armoring approach. And so we do that, we undertake those activities. We create a sense of security or safety that we can now build around these rivers. And so we do that. We encroach into these river floodplains, in these river corridors. And next flood comes through, and the damage is just greater because we often build more, right? Because we have the sense of safety and security around these channels now. So we go back, we dredge or berm and armor again. And it's just sort of this cycle of escalating costs and damage. And particularly when you throw increasing precipitation from climate change into that recipe, you know, it just speeds that cycle up. So getting back to beaver, okay, sorry for that little departure, but I think it was really setting the context for where we are. We are in this situation where we have a high percentage of streams that are unstable in size and disconnected from the floodplains. So what we need to do is we need to reconnect these rivers to the floodplains. This river shown here is one that was restored back in 2006. It was terribly incised. The banks were about 3 feet high. It now has banks that are about 1 foot high, well connected to the floodplain. How do we do that, right? How do we do that? One method, and that's the one that was used here, was to excavate the floodplain down, to reconnect it to the floodplain so the water could spill out in the floodplain, spread out, okay? That's the mechanized approach. It's very expensive, probably to the point that it's really prohibitive at the scale that we need to restore our rivers. Maybe in some cases, it's the thing to do for certain circumstances, certainly in developed areas like Brattleboro along the Whetstone Brook, where they removed a bunch of fill in an old lumberyard building to make way for a floodplain. It's a great solution. But we probably aren't going to endeavor in this a whole lot going forward in this sort of agricultural setting, which is where a lot of our problems, you know, a lot of our incised rivers exist. Another thing we can do is in the form of strategic wood addition. And I think I saw that the Fish and Wildlife presentation included a slide that said wood addition on it. I don't know if they got into that at all, but wood addition in our rivers and streams. Why? Because of all that snagging and removal of the dead wood in the streams that happened back during the preparation for the log drives. We've removed all of the wood from our rivers. The wood is the structure, it's the bones, or I like to talk about it as the framing of the wall, right? We have framing in our walls, right? If we just had insulation, all that insulation would fall over and blow away. Our rivers, the gravels and the sands, that's kind of more like the insulation. The wood is like the structure. It's the studs, right? It's the plates and the sills. So we put that back. And we find that it's not only great for habitat, which is why it was initially undertaken, but it's also great at trapping sediments, both fine and coarse. And if you look at that picture there where I'm standing there, that's a massive river channel. It's you know, about head high, the top of the bank there. But if you look just upstream of that logjam, that channel is about a foot deep. And the banks are like this, and it's got floodplain on either side. So when the flood flows come down, they can spread out on that floodplain, they can slow down, they can be filtered, et cetera. That's a flood mitigation strategy. The other aspect about that is flood mitigation, is that we're storing those large gravels and cobbles. And we all know that when those large gravels and cobbles come downstream and intersect infrastructure, that we have lots of problems. So we're storing water and sediment up on the landscape. Here's a project that we did on that same stream. That was a natural wood jam, so we can replicate that. And here's a project that we did on that same stream. Again, those very high banks. This channel was very, very incised and enlarged. This is looking up from that same location, so you can see again the deep channel. We built about 50 structures. This is down in Windham. Cobb Brook is a direct tributary to the West River. We built about 50 log structures that contained about 3 to 5 logs each in 2020. The 2023 flood came through there and picked those pieces of wood up and threw them around and threw them back down and buried them under sediment, right? Replicating that process. This is all, some of this stuff is referred to as process-based restoration. That is the process. We put the pieces back and we let the process take over. We have filled in, reconnected that river to its floodplain in about 10 to 12 different locations throughout this mile of river that we endeavored to restore. It's very inexpensive and it's very effective. So we went from that deep river channel to that very shallow river channel showed by those yellow lines. We reversed that channel evolution process. This is just another site on that stream. All of that wood above that red hashed line there is wood that accumulated upstream of the jam that you can see at the base of the picture. That's my colleague Murray standing up there just for a little bit of scale. And if we go upstream and look back down at Murray and where he's standing, we see all of the material that filled in the channel and reconnected that channel to its floodplain. And I think our bumper sticker might be store more sediment in headwaters, not houses. This picture from the Vermont Digger was from the West River watershed, and I believe it was the 23 event. So if we can keep and hold all of this material up in the headwaters, we can save a lot of the damage that comes along with this material being transported downstream. All right, so talking about different forms of restoration to get us out of that issue, now to the beaver, the beaver's job in this. So this is an example. So that's wood addition in the upper elevation forested streams. We can also do wood addition and again, that beaver mimicry that Ben talked about and where the settings are appropriate. This is a stream that was channelized and further enlarged due to a culvert under 22A in the town of West Haven. It's on a parcel, a natural area that the Nature Conservancy owns. We call it our Hubbardton River Clay Plain Natural Area. You can see that stream is deeply, deeply incised to that landscape. So how do we go about fixing that? The answer comes from a lot of that work that was done in the Pacific Northwest to restore salmon habitat using these beaver mimicry structures. And this figure on the right provides a great example of how beaver dams influence these incised rivers. So top left is that incised condition. The beaver dam goes in, it kind of widens that channel out. If you shift to the right, you can see that channel is widened out. So now that deep river has become wider. And then if you go down left to C, more beaver dams are built. What happens when that channel widens is that the power of the flow in that channel is really reduced. You take a channel and squeeze that flow into this narrow channel, you have a lot of power. You broaden that out. Now that flow is not as deep. It's a lot shallower. That same volume of flow, right? So that same volume of flow spreads out. It's shallower. There's not much power. So that's when the beavers can really go and expand their dams and their pond complexes. And you can see, how it progresses from there. So this idea of beaver mimicry, and Ben didn't realize that we do all that much of it in Vermont. We don't know to do all that much yet, but we are working to bring that approach to Vermont. TNC has done a number of projects. We've done a number of projects in partnership with the Vermont Land Trust on some of their lands. The Forest Service is working at this. UVM's interested in this approach, and others. I think the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service maybe even have adopted this approach in a couple projects. So again, we build these structures. We pond water. You can see in the aerial view there, we're getting some spreading of that water. And that again is where the flood mitigation comes in. You're really spreading that water out, expanding the volume of that pond. You're sinking that water into the underlying materials. So we're endeavoring to adopt this approach, and we're working hard to help our partners, the watershed organizations that exist throughout the state. We're working hard with the state to enable the funding with clean water funding of these types of process-based restoration projects. It's not something that they initially envisioned under that funding, but we are working to help them to figure out how to calculate the amount of nutrient reduction associated with these projects so that we can then start to apply for that funding to get funding to do these projects. When you look at this approach, it is immensely less expensive than the mechanized engineered approach that we have taken in the past. Not just here in Vermont, really river restoration over the last 25 or 30 years has been really engineering oriented, heavy equipment, really expensive. It's going to keep us from addressing the number of river miles that we really need to address. This approach, much less expensive, we hope we can use the state dollars a lot more cost effectively with these approaches. But in the end, we do need to leave it to the beavers because these systems are constantly being impacted by flows, changing flows, and there's erosion here and erosion there. And if you don't have that rodent in there, continuously building the dams, moving the dams, coppicing the willow and the other shrub species so they regrow more vigorously, these systems are just kind of going to go into a state of decay. So this gets back to that whole conversation around, can we coexist with beavers? Can we bring more beaver onto the landscape? The other thing about beaver is they're there working all the time and in perpetuity. They're also pretty darn cheap. They don't actually have a very good union, so their pay rates are pretty low. And if we want to really get efficient with state dollars around water quality and flood resilience, beavers might be a great answer to that question. I think we have more work to do in looking into that. We certainly have to evaluate the conflicts and how well these coexistence devices really work. But I think it's worth looking into. It's just so, much less expensive than other approaches that we're taking. And the co-benefits that you get, right? You're not just getting clean water, you're getting all that habitat and you're getting that flood resiliency. Or if you're looking for flood resilience primarily, you're not just getting flood resiliency, you're getting the water quality and all of the ecological benefits as well. So it's just, I've been in this river restoration business for about 26 years now, and it's just a solution that makes so much sense from so many angles. So, of course, we have to manage the conflicts. How well do these flow devices really work? I'd like to get better answers on that too, because I'm not an expert in this. I do know that Beaver Solutions down in Massachusetts reports, and I think Ben might have mentioned it, they report like a 99% success rate with their culvert devices. They say they've installed over 1,000 culvert protective devices, and they have a 99% success rate. I think they say they have a 98% success rate or something. I think Ben had that number up, on these pond leveler devices. I'd like to learn more about that because I am not an expert on that. So I would like to learn more about that. The other thing beyond coexistence devices, and this is my last slide, I believe, is that in my experience, I've spent a lot of time all over the state looking at rivers, forest, field, and I have seen a lot of instances where there are places where brooks run, streams run, and despite the fact that they're really close laterally to infrastructure such as Route 7 or land uses such as agriculture, as the Button Farm here, which is now a TNC, Vermont Land Trust conserved property, despite the fact that they're really close laterally, when you look at like a relief map on the right there, you can see that they are really in deep ravines. And if you looked over to the right, you see that stream running in the bottom of that deep ravine. And that stream, if you look at it, that's a really deeply incised stream. It is just a source of fine sediments and nutrients, and it goes directly to the lake. we can put beaver in there, we can build dams, that brook can flood from valley wall to valley wall, and the beaver can do whatever they want. Route 7's never gonna know, and the farmer up on the Button Farm field's never gonna know. I think there are lots of places like this. We have them on TNC lands where we've done work. On that project that I showed you, there's a great example of this where beavers have moved in about 20 years ago, and they existed and nobody even knew it. I think we have lots of areas in the state because of our great relief, right? We have a lot of relief differences in elevation, right? I think there are lots of places where beavers can do their thing, help with water quality and flood resilience, and nobody's going to know any difference. So again, I think we need to look at that more and evaluate the feasibility of that idea, but I think it's an idea worth looking at. And that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Representative Sakowitz.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was really great. The last slide that, previous to this one, where you show us this opportunity that maybe we're not taking advantage of right now, where we could make some of these improvements with beavers, but there's no beavers there now. And that presumably there's more of these sorts of locations spread out around the state. My big question is, how much more? And I think the answer I know is we don't know. So the follow-up that is, how do we figure this out? How do we find out what capacity we have? How many places are there like this? Do we have any tools right now? Do we have mapping right now that we can leverage to add some of this? Do we need additional study? Do we need additional tools? But what do we need to do to find out the answer to that question?
Yeah, so part of that is the mapping, assessing the suitability for beaver habitat, right, is what we're talking about. Where are those areas that are suitable for beaver existence, not beaver habitat, beaver existence. And that does come down, I think the carrying capacity that we really need to focus on is that social carrying capacity, right? I think we know we had tremendous more beavers on the landscape than we do now. If we restored all the vegetation on the landscape, we could support so many more beavers. I think it's the social carrying capacity. I don't want to conflict fish and wildlife. I am not a biologist. Those are my thoughts, but based upon my experience. But I really think we do. So it's the social carrying capacity, the mapping to do that. So here's an example. There's this thing called the Beaver Restoration Analysis Tool that was created out at the University of Utah or Utah State College, where they do a lot of beaver based restoration work because they're in that arid southwest corner of the state. They really benefit from beaver. So there are mapping tools that you can apply to large geographical areas like the entire state of Vermont. They're applying it to like all the BLM lands and public lands like in, the Southwest. So those areas are enormous, right? You can apply that to Vermont and you can start to see where the hotspots are, potential hotspots for beaver existence. The University of Vermont's done a little bit of work with this on a small watershed, just kind of testing that tool and like revising it to fit the Vermont landscape context and, the Vermont forest context, right? It's nothing like the Southwest here. So you have to tweak it. The Forest Service and the Green Mountain National Forest Service had their experts that using this tool from out west run an analysis. I think they just did it on the forest, but they ran an analysis of beaver suitable areas across Vermont using. And this tool again is called the Beaver Restoration Analysis Tool. Great little BRAT acronym. So for those that love acronyms. So yeah, I think that's a first step. And then I think, from there we ground truth that work, right? And we go from there. But and I think the university, I presented at a university conversation the other day where they were looking for topics to focus on for research. And this is one that they thought would be interesting to do. So we bring the university and we get more information before we move forward. Because I think we do have to know what the potential risks are and know that we can evaluate and mitigate those risks of bringing more beavers on the landscape.
Representative Taglivia.
With respect to this property on the slide that you're showing, that you have up. How close is the nearest beaver pond or beaver dam to this location as a potential for beavers to eventually realize it's here and just move in on their own?
Yeah.
Is that a possibility?
Yeah, it's not, I'd say it's a half a mile downstream. And I I'm not a beaver biologist. I'm a river guy. But I will say that I've toured some of the work that the Forest Service has done with their wood addition projects that I showed earlier. They've done a lot of wood addition projects in the forest. And in touring one of those, we stumbled upon, and we were way up in elevation. We were way up on Bingo Brook, drove in all these forest roads to get there, really high in elevation, right? I don't expect to see beaver up there. The beaver took advantage of that wood jam and they started building a dam off of it, way up there. And we had biologists with us and everybody was blown away by the fact that, so the point is, I think beaver can travel a lot greater distance than we know over land to get to places. So I think that mile, half a mile, the mile, that downstream, I think they could definitely make it up there. And I do think that would be the ideal way to do it. It'd certainly be the least expensive way to do it, right? And so that's what we're doing in that project I showed that we're doing. We're trying to create the right habitat, and really that's just creating areas of deep water because they need deep water that doesn't freeze in the winter and that's deep enough to protect them from predation. And if you can achieve that, it's about 3.5 feet of water. If you can achieve that, then there's no reason that, they might not move in on their own if they're close by. And that's what we're hoping at that site that we have.
You said that when you have beaver ponds, that the water does find its way into the
aquifer.
aquifer.
It's just the soils underneath.
Have you seen any issues with areas where beaver ponds or beaver have moved in where there are spring wells and contamination from Giardia? Because that's
That's
a concern with beaver,
Yeah.
correct?
I think that would be a concern. That's a great point. So that would be, these would be the types of things that we really want to make sure that we understand and we're incorporating into whatever plans we come up with to increase the beaver population and presence on the landscape. So yeah, it's a great point.
Another thing to consider regarding conflict.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for, absolutely.
Representative Austin.
Yeah, what determines a drought? How do you, what is it, how do you?
I didn't hear the
Yeah.
question. What determines?
A drought.
Oh,
So my understanding is it's not as simple as you might think. There's a number of different parameters that, length of time without water, looking at stream flow gauges, how high are those, looking at groundwater wells. And I think NOAA's continuously monitoring these different data sources that they have. And it's a combination of that data. And they have some algorithms, right? Then they plug all this data in and it says, yes, we're in a drought. No, we're not in a drought, right? It's kind of it's an anthropogenically created idea, right? Like to say, when are we in a drought? So we've created these thresholds, and when the data tells us we've crossed one of these thresholds, we're in a drought, and that's why NOAA's Drought Center, drought.gov, it's really great. It's where I got that slide, and it's super helpful. It's super informative. So it's just drought.gov.
I just want to follow up a little bit on the mimicry piece, which to me, in my area of Vermont, I've watched beavers move into hidden valleys and do their thing without any need for mimicry or human intervention at all. And I wonder how long you've known about the site on this slide, and half mile is nothing for a beaver. Can you comment on, I'm assuming you're doing mimicry where you find that the habitat isn't quite conducive, but beavers come and they go, and this is what they do. They move around and create the needed areas of landscape.
Yeah. So that's a great point. I think that gets to when do we need to invest our resources restoring places, and when can we let natural process just take care of that itself? And I think the idea of mimicry is first of all, it's selecting the least expensive, right, and the least intensive form of restoration. So we're thinking about this cost. Yeah, but it's still restoration, still active restoration. So we're thinking about that, and in that particular instance, so the reason we focused and we actually try to restore that site, again, that's our HRCP site, and that site sits right smack in the center the wildlife linkage from the Adirondacks to the Green Mountains. TNC has mapped wildlife linkages up and down New England, and TNC more broadly up and down the Appalachians. The Appalachians are in fact a really important migratory corridor, and we're seeing that in climate change as species migrate northward to keep up with changes in their habitat. Sorry for that diversion. And that site is smack dab in one of those corridors. And we are trying to improve the habitat to entice the animals that need to migrate and certainly restore. And what we've found there, we've tried to grow trees there. We've tried a whole bunch of stuff. You get deer browse and you get herbivory from voles and other rodents. And this time around with my influence, we said, let's look at the hydrological system because we know this is not what this site looked like pre-disturbance. Let's address the hydrology. So we're trying to address the hydrology, bring the beaver in. We know that there are beaver downstream and we've seen them actually up onto our site, but they didn't persist. And one of our thoughts is maybe it was predation because the streams there, they're not very big. So they don't have that cover and that depth of water and that big water bodies. So we're thinking, and there's not a lot of wood to work with there either. That's one thing. It's not a forested site. So we had to bring in wood and create these dams. So create the dams and the structure to hold the water. The water changes the soil moisture capacity. You plant the riparian vegetation at the same time because you're holding water and increasing the moisture of that soil in the riparian zone, gives your trees, your plantings, a more of a fighting chance. And it brings, so this site has kind of gone back. If you think about it as a terms of a tipping point, it's gone over that tipping point. It's really hard to bring this site back without active intervention, unless we want to wait 300, 400 years. But we think that with climate change and species migration, the fact that this sits right in a corridor, we want to address this place now and get it serving that function of a migratory corridor. So that's why we did it. In other sites, I think we'd look at them and say, yeah, let nature do its thing and restore the site.
Thank you. Did you have one last question, Representative Austin? Oh, okay. Thank you so much for your
Yeah.
presentation.
Thank you all very much for having me.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Right, members, we are going to reconvene at 1 o'clock to have Matt Chapman back on PFAS. And I just want to actually acknowledge that Annika brought us a vase full of beaver foods that she is ready and willing to help us all with our twig ID skills. So when we go off camera or when you have a moment, if you're interested in learning a little bit more about identification in the winter, which is the most challenging time to do that kind of identification, we have our local expert here to help us with. So with that, we'll go off live.